That is just interesting. I know that I interviewed a veteran who had invaded southern France during World War II, and they had found a charcoal Buick convertible that was run by charcoal power. And he said they ran that until they ran out of charcoal.
Well, they made the wheels go forward, but it's not the kind of car you would want to have.
No, you couldn't drive them today anyway. Too much pollution, right?
Oh, sure, for sure.
I just want to say.
Oh yeah, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, Ellie.
Yeah, I just want to say hello to everyone watching on Facebook and YouTube, and thank you for joining us tonight.
And Pete, if at the beginning, do you just want to go ahead and start the program and throw to me, and I'll give an update on what upcoming programs, or would you like me to start?
You can start it and then hand it over to me, and I'll take it from there.
Fantastic.
You the man.
Oh.
What's the weather like up there, Ellie?
It is above freezing. Finally. Yes,
Chicago.
The snow and the ice has melted. So for the most part,
we had a cold wave down here in Florida. The wind chill factor got down to 70 degrees today.
Oh, heaven forbid.
Well,
not pleasant.
At least not.
Yeah, nice. You brag about it. Nice and balmy down there.
Yeah.
Well, it should be an exciting program today. Really looking forward to this discussion that you have lined up here, Pete.
Okay.
And we got a lot of great things coming up in the coming week as well. It's like we're only 13 days into the new year, and I think we've already done what, Ellie, 7 events?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. We have a busy January. It's exciting.
Yeah.
Wow.
I will play this theme music and start letting people in.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to A Veteran Story with Pete Mecca for Thursday, January 13th. This is the Veterans Breakfast Club. I am not Pete Mecca, as you can tell by my name tag, but Pete is the host of this program. I'm just the pretty face that gets to start the program. But joining me as always is Ellie DiPastino as media producer. Ellie, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. I was just saying how it's finally above freezing here in Chicago, so it makes me a bit happier.
And Pete, you're going to outshine me, but how's the weather where you are?
Well, like I said, it got the wind chill factor got down to 70 degrees today in St. Augustine, but we will survive. Everybody's breaking out their heavy jackets and coats, but we'll be okay.
That's great to hear. We have a lot of events. We were just saying right before we started the live program, we've had a lot of events already halfway through January. VBC is not slowing down in the new year. In fact, we are hitting the ground despite the cold weather. I'm going to go ahead and share screen here, and you can see that tonight we have a veteran story with Pete Mecca and a really special guest, Lou Paper, author. And I will let Pete go ahead and introduce Lou here in a minute. But coming up next week, very interesting Pretty Kittens, a touring female group. If you didn't know that they existed, they did back, and they went to Vietnam. The Pretty Kittens will be on Monday night, January 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Looking forward to talking with them about their experiences over in Vietnam. Following that, Tuesday night, January 18th, 7 p.m., flying with the 15th Air Force. We're going to talking with them and their history about on Greatest Generation Live. That'll be our first one of the new year. And let's see here. Why Did I Survive with Joe Tedeschi will be Wednesday, January 19th at 9 a.m. Our coffee hour is back. If you have not joined us yet for a coffee hour on Wednesday mornings, those are our two main programs. Monday night, 7 p.m., Wednesday mornings, 9 a.m. And then once a month, we check in with Pete Mecca here. Once a month, we check in with Glenn Flickinger for Greatest Generation Live. So we got a very busy later part of the month. And then a members only event. If you haven't heard, we started a membership with VBC. You can sign up for that membership here on our website that you see. It's $36 a year. You get invited to member only events. You get discounts on trips, discounts on swag. You get a nice lapel pin. I'm going to show this because this is a really nice pin. So we'll send that out to you whenever you sign up for a membership. But our first member event is going to be on Saturday, January 22nd. This is going to be Jeopardy. And we have 3 teams of 3. One of them, the full team, is all under 18. And my money's on them to win this all. But we are fashioning some Jeopardy boards to give our contestants a run for their money. So super excited about all this. And I am the host of The Scuttlebutt, and the most recent episode just got released on Monday. Ben Wright is actually here. He's a former board member of the VBC, and he was one of the co-hosts of the most recent episode of the podcast, where we talked with 3 chaplains, one who served during his time in the Air Force, the other 2 retired Air Force and then became chaplains. Ben, I flash over to you for a highlight reel of why should somebody watch this episode of the podcast or listen to it?
Well, it's important because it does talk about the need to minister to veterans as well as those still serving. And it's important to take care of people holistically in body, mind, and spirit. And certainly where people are spiritually has a lot to do with their overall health and ability to perform on active duty and also live productive lives after they leave the military. And I think you particularly enjoy what Mike Wertsmith has to say, who has a very specialized ministry to the homeless in the Pittsburgh area. And about 40% of those are veterans and all the things he's been able to do for them. And then also Eric Fenton is on, who worked a lot with combat air crews and people maintaining aircraft in all walks of Air Force in his time on active duty. So it's a good program, and I would highly commend it to you.
Well, thank you, Ben. And also, Mike actually recorded the episode. He had COVID. It said, "I've been looking forward to this. I'm not missing this." And he came on and he did the whole episode. If he can do a recording while suffering from COVID, and he's doing better now, thankfully, I think everybody else here can give it a listen for an hour. But he was an incredible speaker. Each gentleman, Ben and Eric, both. It was a great episode. Pete, I'm going to kick it over to you to introduce our special guest for tonight. But we're super excited everybody's here with us on a Thursday night. Thank you for being here.
All right. Thank you very much. And I am Pete Mecca, the pretty face behind a veteran story. My guest today is Lou Paper. He is the author of In the Cauldron, Terror Attention, and the American Ambassador's Struggle to Avoid Pearl Harbor. Lou, welcome to the show, buddy.
Hey, thank you for having me, Pete. I'm glad to be here.
You're more than welcome. Who is the American Ambassador in this book?
His name is Joseph Grew. So let's focus on 1941 because that's when the heart of the story takes place. So in 1941, Joseph Grew was 61 years old. He had tall, lean, bushy eyebrows, a full mustache. He had been in the diplomatic corps in the United States for almost 40 years.
Wow.
And he had been America's ambassador to Japan in Tokyo for almost 10 years. Now, he was a high-ranking Republican in both the diplomatic corps and in government, and he was appointed to the post in 1932 by President. And then, of course, Franklin Roosevelt became president on March 4th, 1933. Now, Roosevelt and Grew actually went to school together. They went to prep school together, and they went to Harvard together. And although Grew submitted his resignation when Roosevelt was elected, Roosevelt asked Grew to stay on as the American ambassador. So he did. And as I say, by December 1941, he had been there in the post for almost 10 years.
Wow. All right. Now, in November of 1941, just a few weeks before Pearl Harbor, Ambassador Grew sent a telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Tell us about that telegram. That's
right. So in November 3, 1941, Gru sent a telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who was his superior. And he wanted to warn Hull and Roosevelt that Japan was prepared to launch a suicidal war against the United States. And he said that this war could come with dangerous and dramatic suddenness. And he went on at great length to explain that. And that was important because back in Washington, people could not believe that Japan would attack the United States. The United States was so much larger than Japan, and people thought it would be utterly stupid for Japan to attack the United States. But Gru said in this telegram, he said that you can't, you have to take into account, I hope I didn't lose you there.
You're good.
He said that it might seem foolhardy to you to think that Japan would attack the United States, but he said you have to understand the mentality here. This was like the samurai do or die spirit. And the United States had imposed sanctions, but he said, it might seem foolhardy to you, but Japan would prefer to launch a suicidal war than go on the way things are going.
Wow. What led Gru to send that telegram to Secretary Hull?
But if I can just interject one more point
Sure.
before we get to that question. Gru sent that telegram on November 3, 1941. On November 30, 1941, now this is Sunday, a week before Pearl Harbor, Gru writes in his diary, if war should come, I hope history will not overlook that telegram. How ironic is that? And then a week later, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor.
Wow. Well,
But
like
I interrupted you.
what did lead Gru to send that message?
Well, there were a number of factors, but I think a paramount factor here was the Japanese economy. The United States had imposed economic sanctions on Japan in an effort to curb Japan's military aggression in China. And those economic sanctions had crippled the Japanese economy. And so, as an example, rice was being rationed. There was no gasoline for cars, as we were talking a moment ago. There was no gasoline for cars because all the oil, or virtually all oil, had to be saved for military purposes. Imported coffee was also unavailable. It had been replaced by another brew, about which the New York Times correspondent said it was better not to ask too many questions. So you had Japan on the brink of an economic collapse, and Gru realized that. He thought that it was one of the principal factors that would lead Japan to attack the United States.
Were there any other factors beyond the economy that caused Gru to send the telegram?
Yes, so another factor you have to take is a Japanese mindset. And Gru knew that a crippled economy was going to lead to a sense of desperation among the Japanese, and a sense of desperation was going to lead to war. It was all part of that samurai do or die spirit that still prevailed in Japan. Gru knew that for Japanese leaders, annihilation through a suicidal war with the United States was better than the humiliation of succumbing to American pressure. And so I'll give you a little story that illustrates that Japanese mindset. In the fall of 1941, Gru received word from the American embassy in China about a Japanese soldier who had been captured by Chinese troops in the fighting in China. And the Japanese soldier came from a well-to-do family. And he wanted his family back in Japan to know that he was alive and well. And so Gru passed the word on to the Japanese government in Tokyo about this Japanese soldier who had been captured, and to let them know that the Japanese soldier was alive and well. He soon received a reply from the Japanese government. The Japanese government said that neither it nor this man's family were interested. As far as they were concerned, that Japanese soldier was dead because, said the government, any Japanese soldier who had allowed himself to be captured had dishonored his family and dishonored his government. So that's the Japanese mindset for you.
Wow. I got a lengthy question for you here. What about the Japanese leaders' ability to control the Japanese population and have them obey an order for a suicidal war against the United States. Was that a factor that contributed to Gru's decision to send that telegram to Cordell Hull?
Yes, it was. So let's take a step back. If I was writing a book about Nazi Germany, I would not have to explain to you and those who are watching this about the brutality of the government if it was Nazi Germany. Japan was also a very repressive society. Secret police were everywhere. Surveillance was pervasive. No dissent was allowed. An indiscreet word uttered to a friend, a neighbor, a family member, and a person could find themselves arrested, thrown in jail, and subjected to horrific torture. So Gru understood the upshot of all this, and that's one of the factors that led him to send that telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull in November 1941 to warn about a suicidal war that Japan was prepared to launch, because Gru knew that if Japanese leaders did issue a command to launch a suicidal war against the United States, the Japanese leaders would control the population, and the people of Japan would obey that command, and they would fight to the death in that suicidal war.
Huh. All right, now in 1941, the United States and Japan were having discussions in Washington, D.C. about a possible agreement, to resolve the two countries' differences. Did those discussions factor into that telegram that Gru sent to Hull?
Yes, they did. So, notwithstanding that samurai do-or-die spirit that I mentioned a moment ago, Japanese leaders understood the risk of war with the United States. They always talked about waking up a sleeping giant. The United States was so much larger in terms of resources and population. And so, in the spring of 1941, Japanese leaders supported an initiative to have discussions with Secretary of State Cordell Hull in Washington to explore a possible agreement between Japan and the United States that would hopefully resolve the differences between the two countries. For his part, Secretary of State Cordell Hull knew there's virtually no chance of the United States and Japan reaching an agreement. Hull regarded Japan as one of the worst international desperados in the history of mankind. He subscribed to the view that no words of the Japs, as he called them, on paper would be worth anything. But Hull could not tell that directly to the Japanese representatives who came to Washington in the spring of 1941. Why? Because in the spring of 1941, America's military capabilities were woefully inadequate. And so President Roosevelt and the military chiefs in the United States urged Hull to drag out the conversations with the Japanese as long as possible, to give the United States time to bolster its military capabilities, and to avoid a war in the Pacific for which the United States was not prepared. And so that's what Hull did. From the spring into the summer and the fall of 1941, he spent untold hours talking with the Japanese representatives about an agreement that he knew would never come to fruition. By November 1941, shortly before Gru sent that telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Gru had advised Hull that Japanese leaders were very frustrated about the lack of progress in the discussions with the United States, that Japanese leaders were beginning to sense that the United States was not really interested in an agreement, and that the United States was merely playing for time. But Gru tried to explain in that telegram to Hull, for Japan, time was running out.
All right, well, during this period, the months before Pearl Harbor, did Ambassador Gru make any recommendations to President Roosevelt or to Secretary of State Hull about things that they might be able to do to reduce the chances of war?
Yes, he made numerous recommendations to both Roosevelt and Hull. Many of those recommendations were not even acknowledged. None was accepted. Why? Because back in the United States, people could not believe that Japan would attack the United States, as I mentioned before. And so when Gru made these recommendations about things they could do to avoid the possibility of war, I think the people in the United States, Hull and Roosevelt and those American leaders, they didn't give it much credence. And so, like I say, he made many recommendations. None was accepted.
Yeah, well, that's my next question. None were accepted, right? No recommendation.
No, none of the
Okay.
recommendations he made was accepted.
All right. Well, how did Ambassador Grew feel about being ignored?
Well, he was very bitter and frustrated about it. And he several times he kept a diary. And there are many points in the fall of 1941 when he comments in his diary about the fact that people in Washington are no longer interested in his opinion. And later he would write that after Pearl Harbor, he would say that American policy in those months before Pearl Harbor was completely inflexible, and that his reporting to the government was like throwing pebbles into a lake at night.
Okay. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, Hawaiian time. How did Grew learn about the attack?
Well, that's a good question, and it probably shows the extent to which people in Washington really didn't care about Grew. So when the Pearl Harbor attack is initiated, it was around 7:30, between 7:30, quarter to 8 in the morning in Hawaii. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning on Monday, December 8 in Tokyo. So at the time the Pearl Harbor attack occurred, Grew was asleep in the American embassy in Tokyo with his wife. And so he knew nothing about it. So what happens is, so he wakes up and he gets a call about 7 o'clock. He gets a call from the secretary at the foreign ministry in Japan. And they say the Japanese foreign minister wants to meet with him immediately. So Grew jumps out of bed, doesn't shave, doesn't eat, and he's driven over to the Japanese foreign ministry, and he meets with the Japanese foreign minister. And now you got to remember, this is about 4 or 5 hours after the Pearl Harbor attack has occurred. Grew knows nothing about it. Nobody in Washington bothered to tell Grew that Japan had attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. And so he knows nothing about it. He goes in to talk to the foreign minister, and the foreign minister gives Grew the response of Hirohito, the Japanese emperor. He gives Roosevelt had sent the emperor a message the day before, and the foreign minister merely gave to Grew the emperor's response to President Roosevelt's message from the previous day. Nothing is said about Pearl Harbor. Grew's driven back to the American embassy. He's scheduled to play in a golf tournament that day. He knows nothing about Pearl Harbor. And so he gets back and he's changing his clothes to put on his golf clothes because he's going to go play in this tournament. And he gets a call from the naval attaché in the embassy who says, "Hey, I just heard a report over a San Francisco radio station over the shortwave that says Japan attacked Pearl Harbor." And Grew can't believe it because he's seen that nobody's told him. He didn't receive anything from Washington. The foreign minister didn't say anything. So he sends his counselor back to the foreign ministry to find out if it's true, which of course it was. And so that's how Grew learned about Pearl Harbor, through a short a radio broadcast that they received over the shortwave radio.
That's incredible. All right, I want to take a step back. Didn't Grew send Secretary of State Cordell Hull another telegram much earlier that mentioned a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor?
Yes, he did. And that's another good question. So in January 1941, and now it's about 11 months before Pearl Harbor, Grew has a meeting with the Peruvian foreign minister, with whom he's very good friends, in Tokyo. And the Peruvian foreign minister to Japan comes over to the American embassy, and he tells Grew that one of his staff members knows somebody in the Japanese Secret Service. And he tells him, and he's heard through other sources, that Japan is planning to attack Pearl Harbor in the event of armed conflict. So if there's a war, Japan's going to attack Pearl Harbor. So Grew prepares a telegram and sends a telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull on January 27, 1941. So a little more than 10 months before Pearl Harbor. And he says, "I've received information from the Peruvian minister that in the event of armed conflict, Japan is going to attack Pearl Harbor." So Hull and his staff get this telegram. They look at it, and as I said before, they give no credence to almost anything Grew says. They say he's been in Japan too long. He's a captive of the Japanese thinking. He doesn't have a sense of reality. And they all look at it and say, this is ridiculous. They don't ask Grew any questions. They don't respond to the telegram at all. Grew never received any response to this telegram in January 1941, telling them that there was a chance that Japan was planning to attack Pearl Harbor in the event of an armed conflict.
So that was Washington's response to the telegram. Nothing.
Right, nothing. There was no, they gave it to the Army intelligence and the Naval intelligence in Washington, and they all looked at it and said, there's no evidence, nothing to indicate that Japan's going to attack Pearl Harbor. And that's the way it was left. And so, ironically, on the morning of Pearl Harbor, Kimmel, who is the Navy commander in Pearl Harbor, and Walter Short, who is the Army commander in Pearl Harbor, around 7:30 in the morning on December 7th, as the Japanese planes are descending into Pearl Harbor, they're getting ready to go play golf.
All right. Perhaps our military intelligence should have studied the Japanese raid on Port Arthur during the Russo-Japanese War. About the same thing happened. All right. Now, we're after Pearl Harbor. It's December 8th, 1941 in Tokyo. The United States and Japan are at a state of war. What happened to Grew and the other members of the American embassy?
Well, as soon as Pearl Harbor occurred, Grew and the other members of the American embassy were all arrested and taken as prisoners of war. And they were all placed in the American embassy in Tokyo. And they were held there for about 6 months while the United States and Japan negotiated a diplomatic exchange agreement so that American diplomats in Japan could return to the United States and Japanese diplomats in the United States could return to Japan. And so Grew's held as a prisoner of war in Tokyo for about 6 months. And while he was held there as a prisoner of war, he wrote a 60-page report which detailed his criticism of American policy in those months before Pearl Harbor. And Grew was hoping that when he returned to the United States, that he would give that report to President Roosevelt and to Secretary of State Cordell Hull.
How did Grew feel about being taken as a prisoner of war? I mean, was he bitter about that?
Yeah, I think, well, he understood the rules of the game, so he was bitter about it, but it was just part of the way things go. And so at least he was, kept alive. And so he was glad about that. But, and they were all returned to the United States, but they didn't return to the United States until August of 1942.
I hadn't planned to ask this question, but I think it's relevant. He was there when Jimmy Doolittle and his B-25s bombed Tokyo. Did he ever mention anything about that, or
he never did? No, he never. Not that I recall. I don't think he said anything about that. That I recall about the Doolittle campaign.
Well,
I just don't remember. To be honest, I don't remember him saying anything about that.
Okay. What happened to that report that Grew wrote while he was a prisoner of war?
Well, that's an interesting story in and of itself. So, like I say, Grew planned to give that report to President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull when he returned to the United States. So Grew returned to the United States by ship. They left from Tokyo and went around the Cape of Good Hope. And they went to Rio de Janeiro, and then they switched ships. And while he was on the ship, returning to the United States, Grew wrote a 15-page letter to President Roosevelt. It was a Dear Frank letter. Remember, these guys went to school together. So he didn't say, Dear Mr. President, he said, Dear Frank. And he wrote this 15-page letter because when he docked, when he came back to the United States, Grew planned to give that report to Hull and to President Roosevelt. And he writes this 15-page letter to Roosevelt, summarizes the report, and he says to Roosevelt, I think it's important that you read this report because he said, I am confident that future historians are going to read the report to determine whether Pearl Harbor and the war with Japan could have been avoided. So Grew and his private secretary was a recent Yale graduate. They returned by ship on August 26, on August 25, 1942, and they dock in New York Harbor. As soon as they dock, Grew and his private secretary take a train to Washington, D.C. And then on the morning of August 26, 1942, the very next morning, they go to Hull's offices. Hull's got his offices in the old executive office building, which is right next to the White House. And Grew and his private secretary go there. And the private secretary, this recent Yale graduate, a young guy, he sits in the outer office, and Grew goes into Hull's office by himself. And the private secretary can't hear all the conversation, but he can hear that Hull is yelling at Grew. And after about 30 minutes, Grew comes out of Hull's office, and he's clearly shaken. And Grew says to his secretary, he says, why don't we go to the Metropolitan Club, which was located nearby? And he says, why don't we go to the Metropolitan Club for lunch, which they do. And at the lunch, Grew tells his private secretary what happened. Grew showed that 60-page report to Hull. Hull glances at the report. He sees that the report criticizes decisions and statements which Hull had made in the months before Pearl Harbor. Hull immediately demands that Grew destroy the report. And Grew says he doesn't want to destroy the document. He says, this is my confidential report to my superiors. Hull remains adamant, and he insists. He tells Grew to go home, to think about it, and come back the next morning and tell him whether he will destroy that report. Well, as a practical matter, Grew at the time, rightly or wrongly, believed he had no choice. This is before Watergate and all that, but he didn't know about that. So he's a subordinate official in the State Department, and Cordell Hull is his superior. And so he thinks he's got no choice but to yield to Hull's demand. And so Grew returns to the Secretary of State's office the following morning, and he tells them that he will destroy that report, which he did. And for his part, I should, by the way, add that President Roosevelt, there's no evidence that Roosevelt knew about the report or its destruction. For his part, Grew never publicly acknowledged the destruction of that report, not even when he was asked in a post-war congressional hearing whether he had prepared any report to give to President Roosevelt upon his return to the United States.
Lou, I just saw a message on the chat from somebody who's watching, and they said, wow, this kind of reporting and writing will inspire the conspiracy theorist. There was a big conspiracy behind Pearl Harbor. You want to comment on that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, a conspiracy among the United States officials?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that I don't, let me say that there is no evidence that Roosevelt or his cabinet knew in advance that Japan would attack Pearl Harbor. But, and I've looked at the most private communications. I've looked at personal hand notes that Roosevelt wrote in pencil and that the cabinet officials wrote to each other. I've yet to see or even read about anything that indicates that Roosevelt, like I say, or his cabinet knew about the attack at Pearl Harbor. But like I say, if they had paid attention to Grew, they should have realized that Japan could do something like attack Pearl Harbor, that Japan would attack the United States, and that it might seem like a stupid decision from an American perspective, but from a Japanese perspective, it made perfect sense because Japan felt that it was being pushed into a corner. Yeah. And like I said before, they felt that they were left with a choice of either succumbing to American pressure or launching this suicidal war against the United States that might result in not the annihilation of the Japanese empire. And they said, better we should go down in flames fighting for our country than endure the humiliation of succumbing to American pressure.
Wow. So Gru's back in the States. He's destroyed the letter. What did he do after he returned to the United States?
Well, there's a little irony here. So Gru comes back. You got to remember, now he's 61, 62 years old. He stays in the State Department in Washington. In 1944, Hull resigns, and President Roosevelt appoints a new Secretary of State, and he appoints Gru, who is a Republican. He appoints Gru as the Undersecretary of State in 1940. Wow. And so as Undersecretary of State, Gru is now the #2 person in the State Department. And that means whenever the Secretary of State is outside of Washington, Gru is the acting Secretary of State. And so here's the ultimate irony. In August 1945, Joseph Gru, this diplomat who had tried so hard to avoid war with Japan, is the acting Secretary of State when the United States drops the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Wow. Wonder, is there any evidence or notes about how he felt about those bombs?
Well, I think that he felt that, Truman had done what he thought was necessary to avoid hundreds of thousands of casualties, American casualties, because if they didn't drop the atomic bomb, he understood that if they didn't do that, the Japanese were never going to give up. Like I said before, they had this mindset: you can't be taken prisoner; you have to fight to the death. And so he knew that, and that therefore there would be, 1 million, 2 million soldiers who would have to be launched onto Japanese beaches. And he knew that there would be hundreds of thousands of casualties. So he understood Truman's response. But I will add one thing that's kind of another interesting bit of history. Is after the war, when after Japan surrendered, there was a question about and fashioning a post-war government in Japan. There was a question facing Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of occupied Japan, about whether to get rid of the emperor. And Gru strongly argued that MacArthur should allow Hirohito, the emperor, to remain in place. He said, because the emperor was revered as a god in Japan. And if the emperor remained in place and supported the new constitution that they wanted for Japan, he said that would go a long way in allowing the Japanese people to accept it. Because if their emperor, their god, endorsed it or approved it, he said that would smooth the transition to a new post-war government in Japan. And MacArthur ultimately accepted that advice.
Lou, how did you come to write this book about Joel Gru in Pearl Harbor?
Well, that's interesting. So this is my 6th book. I got the book behind me. If people want to take a look at it, I should probably bring it up here just so you take a look at it. I don't know how there you go.
There you go.
But in any event, so this is my 6th book. I had written books about John Kennedy, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, Bill Paley, the founder of CBS. I even did a book about Don Larson's perfect game in the 1941 World Series between the New York Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers. So about 6, 7, 8 years ago, I was thinking of writing another book. And I wanted to write a book about America in 1941. And the idea came to me because 1941 was a pivotal year for the country. Franklin Roosevelt in January had been inaugurated for an unprecedented 3rd term as president. The UAW signed its first contract with a car manufacturer. The New York Yankees' Joe DiMaggio hit safely in 56 consecutive games, a record which still stands. And of course, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. In the course of my doing research for that book, I came across the name of Joseph Grew and his effort to orchestrate an agreement between Japan and the United States to avoid the war he saw coming. And so I was intrigued. And the more I researched, the more I realized that Grew's story had never been told. There are countless books about Pearl Harbor, I need not tell you. And the Grew is mentioned in a lot of these books, but no other book had ever focused on Grew's story, had focused on Grew's perspective, what he was doing, what happened, what he said, what he did. And so I thought it was a fascinating story. And so I switched gears to tell that story.
That's very interesting. Now, there's a lot of history in your book. I know that. A lot of things about what happened that year. But in writing this book, how much importance did you attach to your descriptions of the people involved?
Well, to me, this is a history book, but I want it to read like a novel. I mean, this is about people. And so my goal was, notwithstanding the amount of research, and it's a history book, I wanted people to be able to read the book like they would read a book of historical fiction and keep them and make it interesting to the reader. I didn't want it to be dense. I wanted it to be light, breezy. And to accomplish that, I wanted to bring the characters to life for the reader. So I'll give you a good example. President Roosevelt. He's a central figure in this drama. Most of us, if not all of us, have seen those films of President Roosevelt in the well of the United States House of Representatives on December 8, 1941, saying that December 7, 1941 is a date that will live in infamy because of Japan's surprise attack on the US naval base in Pearl Harbor. And when you see those films of Roosevelt, he looks so strong. He sounds so vibrant. And yet, here was a man who had been stricken by polio and could not walk. And so I'm writing the book and I'm saying, I gotta make sure people understand this, the limitations that this guy had. You and I and the rest of the people who are watching this, we get up in the morning, we go to the bathroom, we do our business, we come back, we get dressed, and we go about our day. Roosevelt could not do those things without assistance. And that assistance was not provided by his wife, Eleanor. She had her own bedroom down the hall in the White House. And more than that, she was almost always traveling. Instead, Roosevelt relied on a valet. And Roosevelt had 2 valets during his 12 years in the White House. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could find some commentary from those valets about what Roosevelt was really like in those private moments with his valet. And I was able to find that commentary. I learned that in those private moments with his valet, Roosevelt almost always displayed a sweet, amiable disposition. You got to remember, these valets are people who helped Roosevelt get dressed, helped him in the bathroom. Roosevelt's valet in December 1941 was Arthur Prettyman, a big black man who was a chief petty officer in the United States Navy. Prettyman was also a very good-looking guy. And although Prettyman was married, Roosevelt liked to tease him about being a lady killer. And every time Roosevelt would tease Prettyman about being a lady killer, Prettyman would respond, "One does not refute the chief executive, Mr. President."
Did you provide the same, I guess the word is intimacy, in describing Grew as you did for FDR?
Well, yes, I tried to, certainly. I wanted to provide the same intimacy so that the reader gets to know, what was this guy like as a person? And to do that, what I did was I interviewed many members of his family, his grandchildren, his cousins, his great-grandchildren. They told me many stories that were useful. And as long as you're asking me about it, one story that they told me stood out because it displayed Grew's stature and his diplomatic skills. It was January 1949. Grew was asked to provide some remarks at a dinner being held to honor General George C. Marshall, who was retiring as Secretary of State. General Marshall had been Chief of the Army during World War II. And after the war, President Truman appointed General Marshall as Secretary of State. And now in January 1949, General Marshall was going to retire to his farm in Virginia with his wife. At this dinner was General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his wife, Mamie. In his closing remarks in honor of General Marshall, Grew said all he wants to do is retire to his farm in Virginia with Mrs. Eisenhower. Well, as soon as he said that, people began to laugh, just like you're laughing. Grew immediately recognized his mistake and quickly and coolly said, "My apologies to the general." At that point, General Eisenhower blurted out, "Which general?"
That's a great story. All right, you mentioned the conversations with Ambassador Grew's family. What about documents? Did they provide you with any good documents?
Yeah, so the documents that I had access to a lot of documents. There were a lot of memoirs, a lot of diaries, transcripts. There was an enormous number of documents that I relied on. The most important document, though, was Grew's diary. This guy was incredibly disciplined. Almost every evening or on the weekends during his long diplomatic career, remember I said he'd been a diplomat for almost 40 years, he would sit at his desk, his pipe clenched between his teeth, his Smith Corona typewriter in front of him, and he would type out what had happened, what had been said, what he thought in the previous day. So I had access to thousands of pages of Grew's diary. I knew almost everything he did, everything he said, and everything he thought in those months before Pearl Harbor. I knew what time he got up in the morning. I knew that his favorite Scotch whiskey was Johnny Walker Red. And I knew too about his very deep feelings for his wife, Alice. In fact, in many respects, this book is a love story because of that deep feelings he had for his wife.
Huh. Well, okay. You mentioned his wife, Alice. What was she like?
Well, so Grew met Alice. Her name was Alice Perry. She came from a prominent family in Boston. They met in 1904. I should back up. The funny thing is, Grew had just come back, ironically, in 1904. Here he is, a young man. He'd just come back from a trip to Japan, and he saw some beautiful woman at the dance he went to in the Somerville Hotel in Boston. And he asked to be introduced to this woman because she had just come back from Japan.
Huh.
And his friend went out to find this woman and came back with not that one, but came back with Alice Perry, who is also tall, vivacious, beautiful woman, long dark hair. And Grew said, I didn't want to meet with you. He hadn't polished his diplomatic skills yet. But in any event, so this woman comes over who he hadn't expected to meet. And so they started dating, and they got married in 1905. So Alice, like I said, she came from a prominent family in Boston, but she had little formal education, in part because her family was almost always traveling. But Alice, like I said, she was beautiful, tall, vivacious, long dark hair. She was smart. She had a lot of opinions, and she wanted to share those opinions with her husband. And he was willing to listen. Grew told his daughters that he rarely made an important decision or sent out an important communication without consulting Alice. But Alice was a formidable force in her own right. And that was illustrated by a story told by Grew's private secretary. And this story concerned a social evening at the American Embassy in Tokyo shortly before Pearl Harbor. The Grews had invited over for dinner Sir Robert Craigie, who was the British ambassador to Japan, and his wife, Lady Craigie. The Grews liked Sir Robert Craigie. The Grews did not like Lady Craigie. They thought she was a nasty woman. In any event, at these events at the American Embassy dinners, the Grews would often show a movie after dinner. The problem was the projector they used to show the movie was almost always breaking down. And so on this particular occasion, as the Grews and the Craigies were sitting there after dinner watching a movie, the projector again broke down. And as I mentioned before, the Grews liked Sir Robert Craigie. They didn't like Lady Craigie. They thought she was a nasty woman. In any event, when the projector again broke down, Lady Craigie, perhaps true to form, turns to Alice and said, "Isn't it unfortunate, my dear, that that machine of yours is always breaking down?" Without skipping a beat, Alice turned to Lady Craigie and said, "Yes, but isn't it great that we have no important guests tonight?"
Oh, I like that. I think I would have liked her. What a sense of humor.
Yeah.
All right, now looking back on your research.
I'll tell you one other story. I got to
Go
tell you
ahead.
one other story.
Sure.
If you don't mind. I mean, she was also a nice woman. She really ran the embassy with an iron fist. I mean, she was a tough, she was in charge. Rue was in charge of policy and all that. She ran the household. I have to digress. It reminds me of my father. My father would always say to me, this goes back many years now, and he would say to me, in our house, Lou, I make all the important decisions. Vietnam, civil rights, wage policy, those are all within my bailiwick. The other decisions, where we live, how we spend our money, what we buy, all those unimportant decisions are made by your mother. So in this case, Alice, like I say, Rue was in charge of policy, but Alice ran the household, and you're talking about a place that had over 100 employees, and during the when Rue and the other members of the American Embassy were held as prisoners of war there, Gru's private secretary, this guy I mentioned to you in the story when talking about the report, he was a recent Yale graduate. He was about 22 years old. And he would often be told to take the things down to be washed. And Alice gave him, she had these treasured silk curtains that she got, I forget where she got them from, but she treasured them. And she gave them to this guy, Robert Feary was his name. She gave them to the private secretary and she said, put these in the wash. Well, he made the mistake of also putting in the wash his black socks. Oh. And so when the wash came out, these perfectly beautiful white silk apron, curtains rather, were now gray. And he had mortified. He didn't know what was going to happen to him when he brought these gray silk curtains back to Alice. And he sheepishly brought him back and apologized, explained he'd put his black socks in with the white silk curtains. And Alice was kind enough she looked at it, and then she looked up at him and said, well, gray has always been my favorite color, which I thought was really a very nice gesture on her part.
Wow.
So.
What a great story. Look, looking back on all your research and writing this book, tell me and all of us, what was your ultimate goal in doing this? And then we'll open the floor for questions.
Well, my ultimate goal was, from a factual perspective, I wanted to tell Gru's story. What was he about? What did he do? What did he think? And did it make a difference? And would it have made a difference? There's a question, if his recommendations had been accepted, would Pearl Harbor have occurred? Nobody can really answer that question, but I wanted to make sure, we all think about Pearl Harbor, understandably so, that it was a surprise attack. It was a horrible thing that happened, and Japan was rightly punished for it afterwards. But there's more to the story than just a bunch of planes showing up at Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning. There was a lot of factors and dynamics that lay behind that. And to get a full understanding of what happened, I think you need to read Gru's story so that you can see that the attack at Pearl Harbor was not merely a clash of governments. It was the product of the personalities, the perspectives, and the prejudices of people like you and me and the people who are watching this. These were not decisions driven from up high. These were the decisions that were the product of decisions and actions taken by people like us. And so I wanted people to understand that, because I think a lot of the lessons you can learn from what precipitated Pearl Harbor has relevance today in our dealing with other countries with whom we are adversaries and who don't share our perspectives on government or human rights and things of that nature.
All right. I got one more question before we take some other questions. Did Gru or his wife speak Japanese?
No, they did not. I mean, and that's a really good question. And that was purposely so. So Gru had served, and his wife, they had served in embassies all over Europe. And they were good linguists. Gru spoke fluent German. He spoke fluent French, as did his wife. Alice Gru as well, spoke fluent. She spoke Italian, French, German. So they mastered all these foreign languages, but they purposely decided not to learn how to speak Japanese. And the reason they did that was Japanese is a very, very difficult language. It's one of the most difficult languages to learn. And they were afraid, Gru was afraid that he would embarrass himself, because he said, I could learn some Japanese and I might be able to speak a few phrases and I might be able to have simple sentences, whatever. He said, but to have any kind of sophisticated conversation, it would take too much time and effort to master the Japanese language. And so he's decided better to have an interpreter do it and not make a fool of myself. And so in the mornings, he would get all these Japanese language newspapers, and they had linguists in the American embassy. And these guys would come up to Gru's office. If you can imagine this, they would come up to Gru's office with this Japanese language newspaper, and they had more than one. And they would read to Gru all the stories that he wanted to learn about. And so they would interpret it for him. So,
Wow.
So that's a long response to your question.
Wow. Okay, let's open the floor for questions. Any questions to Lou? All right. Sean, Ellie, you got any questions for Lou?
I see
Well-
there's one in the chat here from Greg Yost. He says he might have missed this because he was multitasking, but as ambassador, was Gru ever told about the breaking of purple and of JN 25?
I'm sorry, was he ever told about what?
This
I
says
missed what you said.
Greg said the breaking of purple ? Is that
Japanese code.
That's a Japanese. That's a Japanese diplomatic code. The answer is no. Gru knew none of that, and in fact, he acknowledged. Well, let me take a step back. So the breaking of the purple, the diplomatic code, that was a very important development for the United States. Now, remember that's different than the naval code, the military code, and the purple code. They were separate. The purple was the civilian government, and so Gru didn't know about that. And he said there were probably a lot. Even when he was making recommendations, he said there's probably a lot of things going on that I don't know about. And he said, it's not my job is not to worry about what I don't know. My job is to tell you what I do know and what I see here, and report on that. And so, that's what he did. And so he didn't know about that.
Okay. I know that Roefort in Pearl Harbor finally pretty well broke the Japanese military code. That's how we found out about the attack on Midway. But if we had already broken the Japanese diplomatic codes, purple, was there not any kind of information they could decipher in those codes in those, from purple that maybe Pearl Harbor was in danger?
Well, no, because this is a funny thing about Japan. Well, I'll say there's two responses to that. First of all, Japan had a very strange system of government. It was not in any way like the United States government. Here we have a president who oversees the civilian side of the government, and our president is also the commander-in-chief of the military. So he has command over everything, the civilian government and the military. In Japan, the military was completely separated from the civilian government. So the prime minister in Japan, he had control over only the civilian government. He had no control over the Navy or the Army. The Navy and the Army were separately controlled by their generals, and both the prime minister reported to the emperor, and likewise the military reported to the emperor. But the military had no obligation to tell anything to the prime minister or the civilian government. And in fact, the civilian government was often in the dark about what was going on. And so they didn't know, the people in the civilian government did not know about Pearl Harbor until the attack on Pearl Harbor, until after it had occurred.
Holy cow.
They knew that something was going to happen, but the Japanese foreign minister, who I mentioned a moment ago, had met with Grew in the morning after Pearl Harbor. That foreign minister he learned about the attack at Pearl Harbor only after it had been initiated. That's when he was in the civilian side of government. And so he knew nothing about it. So that's an important point to keep in mind here, that you have two separate forces of government that they talk to each other, but the military did not share information with the civilian side. In any event, yes, the United States read diplomatic cables. And so when Grew was making reports to Hull and whatever, they had seen what the civilian leaders, not the military leaders, what the civilian leaders in Japan were saying to each other. And they made their own interpretation as to what it meant. And oftentimes, they did not disclose to Grew that what they knew or how they were interpreting it. And in many cases, they were interpreting these cables and these communications between the civilian members of the government, making their own judgments, which turned out not to be accurate because they made assumptions about what people were doing, what they were thinking, without really knowing the dynamics of Japanese government.
That's interesting. In Japan, the military started the war, not the politicians. And I remember
Right.
General Westmoreland once said that in America, military doesn't start wars, politicians start wars, which is true. All right. One
There
lady, well, gentleman, I believe, was asking the question, how long did Ambassador Grew live after World War II?
Well, Grew died, ironically, in May of 1965, just a few days before his 85th birthday. Right. He retired in 1945 after Japan surrendered. He retired, and he lived for 20 years thereafter, and he had a home in Washington, D.C. And he died there, as I say, in May of 1965.
Wow. Ellie, any more questions?
I see that Ben right here has his hand raised.
Okay, Ben.
Yes. How did Ambassador Grew respond to the U.S. Stopping petroleum exports to Japan in August of 1941?
Well, he was opposed to that because he said the United States was imposing these economic sanctions on Japan in the belief that if they, squeezed the screw tightly, Japan would buckle. And Japan would yield to what the United States wanted in terms of its military policy in Japan and elsewhere. And Grew, not on any philosophical grounds, Grew tried to explain, as I mentioned before, that the Japanese mindset didn't work that way, that if you push Japan into a corner by squeezing things and by stopping oil, for example, He said it's going to lead to a sense of desperation. And contrary to what American policymakers might think, he said, it's not going to make Japan more submissive. To the contrary, it's going to make them more aggressive because they're going to feel cornered. And if the Japanese mindset, if they feel cornered, they would rather fight to the death in support of whatever they thought was right, rather than endure the humiliation of succumbing to American pressure.
Huh. It sounded like the United States was at opposite ends with the Japanese government. It looks like there was misunderstandings on both sides. It's a shame that the ambassadors weren't allowed to do their job, and Japan thought themselves backed into a corner and had no other choice.
Well, that was, rightly or wrongly, that was Gru's perspective. He said, you have to understand the Japanese mindset, as I mentioned earlier in the broadcast. He said, with a crippled economy, that's going to lead to a sense of desperation among the Japanese, and a sense of desperation typically in this country leads to war. They're not, you can squeeze them. They will always pull in their belt another notch. They will eat that much less rice. They will do what they have to survive, but they will not give in. It's not in their nature. It's just like, you read these stories, I'm sure you've read them, where Americans would go to these Pacific islands where the Japanese were holed up years and years after the war was over. Yeah. And they'd find some Japanese soldier still living in the cave because he wouldn't surrender. Because like I told you, the idea of surrendering and becoming a capture, it just was not in the mindset. And going back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the military, notwithstanding the devastation that those bombs imposed, military leaders wanted to continue to fight. And it was Hirohito, the emperor, who finally stepped in and said he saw that what the United States, the weapons they had, and he said they're going to literally annihilate Japan. The country won't exist anymore. And Hirohito finally stepped in, and he was the one who made a broadcast in August 1945 to announce the surrender. And it was done against the advice of a lot of people in the military, like I say, who wanted to fight. And by the way, as a little footnote, when Hirohito made that broadcast in August 1945, for most Japanese, it was the first time they ever heard the emperor speak.
Yeah, I remember that. All right, if you look at what Japan was doing in China, they were being very aggressive elsewhere. They had a strong military, good aircraft carriers. They had some great battleships. They were a power. But did Japan have any other choice? And did the United States have any other choice?
Well, those are complex. The short answer is, I don't know. I'm just saying Gru thought that there was a chance. The problem that you have from the United States perspective, Hull, well, let me back up. Roosevelt wanted to meet with the Japanese prime minister. Roosevelt had great confidence in his ability to deal with foreign leaders. And so he believed that if he had a chance to meet with the Japanese foreign minister, the prime minister, Roosevelt had a high degree of confidence in his own abilities as a negotiator and thought that maybe he could work something out. But Hull convinced Roosevelt that he should not meet with the Japanese prime minister unless and until there was an agreement that everybody was satisfied with. Hull knowing that there was no chance of any agreement being reached. And in Hull's mind, and to some extent this is understandable, he and a lot of Americans had in mind Munich. They remembered when Neville Chamberlain, the British prime minister, came back from a meeting with Hitler in Munich and waved that piece of paper saying he had reached an agreement with Hitler and this was peace in our time. And of course, the rest is history, and it was not peace in our time. And Hull would always say, I was opposed to the first Munich, and when it comes to Japan, I'm not in favor of having a second Munich. So that's why I say that there was a challenge there of a mindset in the United States that would be difficult to overcome.
Wow. I guess the biggest word in the dictionary is if. if
Right.
Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, we may have had to go to war with Germany in the long run anyway. Big if.
Well, the is well, here's the irony. The irony is that Japan, although they were in alliance with Germany, Japan did not give Hitler any advance notice that Pearl Harbor was about to be attacked. As soon as Pearl Harbor was attacked, Hitler saw this as his opening, and he thought this is good because he can engage the United States in war. The United States is going to have two fronts, on a Pacific front and an Atlantic front. And he thought that the United States would not be able to handle that challenge of a two-front war. And so, ironically, Roosevelt really did not want to get into a war with Japan. Roosevelt wanted to fight Hitler. Roosevelt was most concerned with Hitler in Europe, and that's why Hull has so much more power or influence over our policy toward Japan, because Roosevelt was focused on Europe and Germany and Great Britain. And the irony was that Roosevelt never declared war against Germany, because I don't know if the American people would have supported a unilateral statement of war by Roosevelt against Hitler. But Roosevelt didn't have to worry about that, because on December 11th, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States.
Yeah.
And so he made it easy for Roosevelt. Roosevelt didn't have to worry about convincing the American people to go to war against Germany.
Yeah. I read in several books that when Hitler got the news that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, one of his first statements was, "Now there's no way we can lose."
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because, remember, the United States didn't have a big military at the time. I mean, they, as I mentioned before, Roosevelt and the military chiefs had been urging Hull to drag out the conversations with the Japanese in 1941 to give the United States time to bolster its military capabilities, because they were so woefully inadequate. And I'm sure, and Hitler probably had some sense about the state of play for the United States in terms of its military capabilities. And so I think he thought that I've got him, and he had obviously a huge military arsenal behind him. And he knew Japan did likewise. And he probably thought between the two of those countries, they could squeeze the United States.
Yeah.
But he underestimated the United States.
Yeah, he did. That's why the Battle of Midway was so important. That could have gone the other way, and we've been in deep trouble for a long time. Any more questions floating around out there? Ellie, do you see any? All right.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see any here.
Okay. Lou, this has been a most interesting subject. A great book. You and I will exchange books. We'll email each other later, or maybe tomorrow. I want to thank you for coming on. I learned a lot of things tonight that I never knew and thought that I did.
Well, thank you for having me. I always love talking about this.
I know you do, and I love hearing about it too. Good night, everybody. Great show.
All right. Thanks again.